Every person you have ever met has a story about you running in their head right now. Not the story you would tell, not the accurate one. A story assembled from fragments, the way you answered one email, the tone in your voice during one meeting, something someone else said about you at a party you weren't at. And here is the part that changes everything once you see it. That story was never handed to them by you. It was built in your absence. Most people believe reputation is something you earn slowly, through consistent good work, and that eventually the truth becomes obvious to everyone. This feels fair. It feels like how things should work. It is also, in practice, almost never how things actually work. Successful people operate from a different premise. They understand that perception is not a mirror reflecting reality back at them. Perception is a story assembled by other people's brains, using whatever material is closest at hand. And if you do not supply that material, someone else will, not out of malice but out of necessity. Human beings cannot function around an unexplained person, an unexplained colleague, an unexplained decision, an unexplained silence. These create a kind of pressure. Something has to fill the space, so something does. This is the pattern almost nobody names directly, but everyone who has ever watched a talented person get passed over or a mediocre performer get promoted has felt its effects. The passed-over person assumed their work would speak for itself. The promoted person made sure their intentions, their reasoning, their value were already understood by the people who mattered, before those people ever had to guess. Have you noticed how some people never seem to get misjudged, even when they make real mistakes? It is not because they are better at avoiding mistakes. It is because they never leave the interpretation of the mistake up for grabs. They get there first. Consider what happens in the space between an event and its explanation. A project falls behind schedule. A promotion goes to someone else. A comment gets taken the wrong way in a meeting. In that gap, between what happened and what it means, there is no story yet. There is only material. And material unclaimed gets claimed by whoever reaches it first. Usually that is not the person it's about. It's a colleague filling in blanks with their own anxieties. A boss defaulting to the simplest explanation, because simple explanations require the least effort to believe. A rival, quietly relieved to have a narrative that flatters their own position. This is the principle almost nobody sees. Ambiguity is never actually neutral. It always resolves into something. And what it resolves into depends far more on who moves first than on what actually happened. Most people think staying quiet during an ambiguous moment is humility, or professionalism, or simply good manners. Let the facts speak. Don't make a fuss. Don't seem defensive. Successful people see this differently. They see silence in an ambiguous moment as an unattended door. Not because they distrust people, because they understand how meaning gets made. Meaning is not discovered. Meaning is constructed in real time by whoever is present and whoever speaks first with any confidence. Think about how often the first explanation offered for something becomes the explanation, even after better information arrives. A company misses earnings, and within hours, an analyst offers a tidy reason: leadership missteps, market softness, poor execution. That reason gets repeated in every subsequent article, whether or not it was ever confirmed. Weeks later, more nuanced information appears. It rarely displaces the first story. It just gets treated as a footnote to it. The same mechanism operates on an individual level, just quieter. Someone leaves a meeting 5 minutes early once, for a legitimate reason, and says nothing about why. If no explanation exists, one gets manufactured. They must not have cared. They must have had somewhere more important to be. They must be checked out on this project. None of this may be true. It doesn't matter. The vacancy got filled. This is why people who seem to move effortlessly through organizations, who seem to get the benefit of the doubt again and again, are not simply lucky or naturally charismatic. Many of them have quietly internalized a habit most people never develop. They do not leave meaning unclaimed. Before a decision looks strange, they've mentioned the reasoning. Before a project looks behind, they've flagged the trade-off. Before a silence looks like disengagement, they've named what the silence actually is. This is not about spin. Spin is dishonest framing applied after the fact, usually in defense. What we're describing is the opposite: honest framing applied before the fact so that no defense is ever required. There's a meaningful difference between explaining your intentions before anyone doubts them and explaining your intentions after they already do. The first is leadership. The second, however well done, always sounds a little bit like an excuse. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing how much of what we call reputation is actually just a question of timing. Who described the situation first and how clearly? You start noticing that the people who seem to be naturally well regarded are more often than not simply people who never left an important gap unfilled. They were not defending their story. They were writing it calmly before anyone else picked up the pen. And this raises the real question underneath all of it. Not whether you should manage how you're perceived, but why so few people ever learn to do it on purpose. Here is where it gets interesting. Because once you accept that unclaimed narratives get filled by default, a harder question follows. Filled with what exactly? What does the human mind reach for when it needs to explain an ambiguous person or situation quickly? It does not reach for the most accurate story. It reaches for the most available one. This is not a flaw in certain people. It is how cognition works for everyone, including you. The brain is not built to conduct a thorough investigation every time it encounters an unexplained gap. It is built to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible, using whatever information requires the least additional effort. Psychologists call this cognitive ease. The mind prefers explanations that are simple, familiar, and require no further work, even when more complex, accurate explanations are available. This is why the first plausible story about a situation tends to stick, even when it's wrong. Not because people are lazy or uncharitable, because the alternative, sitting in genuine uncertainty about a colleague, a decision, a set of numbers, is uncomfortable, and the mind resolves discomfort quickly whenever it can. Most people miss this entirely. They assume that if the truth is on their side, the truth will eventually surface because truth has some kind of natural buoyancy. It doesn't. Truth has no advantage over a competing story unless someone puts in the work of telling it. A more accurate, more complete story does not automatically outcompete a simpler, earlier one. If anything, the opposite tends to happen. The first story becomes the frame everyone else measures new information against, so anything that contradicts it starts to look suspicious, rather than the earlier story looking incomplete. This is the same mechanism behind why first impressions carry disproportionate weight. Not because early information is inherently more important than later information, but because early information arrives when the mind has no competing frame yet. It gets to build the frame, everything after that gets filtered through it. A hiring manager forms an impression of a candidate in the first several minutes of an interview. This has been well documented. What's less discussed is what happens next. The manager does not evaluate the rest of the interview neutrally. They unconsciously search for evidence that confirms the impression already formed, and they discount evidence that contradicts it. This is not a character flaw in the manager. It is the default operating mode of a mind that has already, quietly decided on a story and is now just checking for confirmation. This is the principle underneath everything. The mind does not update evenly. It anchors early and it revises reluctantly, which means the moment you can shape, far more than any moment after it, is the first moment someone forms an impression of a situation involving you. Successful people intuit this, even if they've never studied the psychology behind it. They understand at some working level that they are not simply being observed, they are being narrated continuously by the people around them, and that narration runs mostly on autopilot unless someone interrupts it with better material. Consider what this means for how mistakes get processed. A junior employee makes an error on a project. If nothing is said, the mind of every observer fills in a cause: carelessness, incompetence, disengagement, because those are the simplest, most cognitively available explanations for a mistake. But if that same employee says, plainly and early, "I made an error here because I prioritize speed over double-checking. Given the deadline, here's what I'm changing," something different happens. The observer is not left to invent a cause. A cause has already been supplied, and it is a coherent one. The mind does not need to manufacture an explanation because an explanation already exists. It simply accepts the one on offer. because acceptance requires less effort than invention. This is not spin, and it is not making excuses. It's supplying the raw material the mind was going to use anyway, just accurate raw material, instead of whatever fear-based guess would have filled the space. There is a deeper psychological pattern operating here too, one that explains why people who narrate their own situations tend to be trusted more, not less. When someone volunteers an honest account of their own reasoning, especially including the parts that don't flatter them, it signals something the brain finds very persuasive. This person has nothing to hide because they are already telling me the hard part. That signal does more to build trust than a flawless track record ever could, because flawless track records look curated, and curated things trigger suspicion. A person who names their own trade-offs looks less like someone managing an image and more like someone simply being honest, even though functionally both are the same act of shaping the story. This is the paradox at the center of narrative control. It looks like the opposite of authenticity, but done well, it is authenticity, just authenticity that arrives before anyone had to extract it through doubt. Most people think this kind of self-narration is what confident people do because they're comfortable with attention. It's closer to the reverse. People who understand the narrative vacuum aren't comfortable being watched. They've simply realized that being watched is unavoidable, and the only real choice is whether the watching happens with their input or without it. There's a version of this dynamic that plays out over years instead of moments, and it's worth naming, because it explains something that confuses a lot of talented people. Why doing excellent work is often not enough. Careers are not evaluated primarily by continuous observation. They are evaluated by summary, a manager's memory of your year, condensed into a few sentences before a promotion committee. A client's impression of a project, reduced to one line in a recommendation. A colleague's account of working with you, compressed into an anecdote they tell at a dinner years later. Nobody is replaying the footage of your actual work. They are recalling the story they built about your work, and stories compress. Detail gets lost. What survives is the frame. This is why two people can produce comparable output over a year, and one gets remembered as the person who carried that project, while the other gets remembered as solid, did their part. The difference is rarely the work itself. It's whether the story of the work got told clearly at the moments when it was being formed by someone with accurate information, namely the person who did it. Most people find this uncomfortable to hear because it sounds like it's rewarding self-promotion over substance. But that's a false choice, and it's worth being precise about why. There is a real difference between manufacturing a story that isn't true and making sure a true story doesn't go untold. The first is dishonest. The second is simply refusing to let good work disappear into the compression of other people's memory. Think about how this plays out in a team setting. A project succeeds. Multiple people contributed. If nobody frames the contributions clearly as they happen, this part was the data model, this part was the client relationship, this part was catching the flaw before launch, then credit doesn't distribute according to actual contribution. It distributes according to whoever was most visible, most recently mentioned, or most senior in the room when the summary got written. This isn't unfair in some moral sense. It's just how compression works. The people who understand this don't hoard credit or diminish others. They simply make sure the accurate version of events exists somewhere before the compressed version replaces it. This is the shift worth sitting with. The goal is not to control what people think of you in every moment. That's exhausting, and it's not actually possible. The goal is to make sure that at the specific moments when a lasting impression is being formed, a first meeting, a post-mortem after a mistake, a summary at the end of a project, the accurate version is the one available to be remembered. You are not fighting a constant battle for perception. You are showing up at a handful of high-leverage moments and making sure the vacancy gets filled correctly. This reframes something that often looks like modesty, but is actually closer to self-erasure. There's a common belief that the most professional thing to do is stay quiet and let outcomes speak. But outcomes don't speak. People speak about outcomes, and they speak using whatever story was easiest to construct at the time. A brilliant result with no context attached to it gets absorbed into whatever narrative was already circulating, often one centered on someone else entirely. simply because that person was more visible during the process. There's a quieter cost to this pattern too, one that shows up over years rather than single moments. People who never narrate their own work don't just lose credit on any one project. They lose the compounding effect of being known for something. Reputation is built less by volume of good work and more by repetition of a clear story. A person known for catching problems before they escalate, known for handling difficult clients calmly, known for finishing what they start. That kind of reputation doesn't accumulate automatically from doing the work. It accumulates from the work being narrated clearly, consistently by someone. And if it isn't the person who did it, it's built haphazardly, if at all, out of whatever fragments happen to circulate. This is the pattern in full. Perception is not a passive record of what happened. It is an active, ongoing construction, built moment by moment out of whichever material reaches people first, told most clearly, at the moment's impressions are actually being formed. Successful people are not obsessed with image. They have simply stopped assuming that good outcomes translate automatically into accurate understanding, and they've started treating the explanation of their own work as part of the work itself. Not an indulgence layered on top of it, but the final, necessary step that makes everything before it visible. Which brings us to the real question. If perception is constructed this predictably, why do so few people ever learn to construct it on purpose? And what is actually happening psychologically in the moment someone decides to speak up rather than stay silent? Let's go deeper into the psychology, because there's a question sitting underneath everything so far. If narrating your own story works this well, why doesn't everyone do it? Why do so many capable, intelligent people default to silence instead? The answer isn't confidence or lack of it. It's a specific piece of wiring most people never examine. The brain treats being misunderstood as a smaller risk than being seen as self-promoting. This isn't a rational calculation. It's an old social instinct, and understanding it explains almost everything about why narrative control feels uncomfortable, even to people who intellectually know it works. For most of human history, humans lived in small groups where reputation was collectively managed, and individual self-promotion was genuinely dangerous. A person who stood up and declared their own value without the group's consensus behind them risked being seen as a threat to the social order, someone trying to claim status the tribe hadn't granted. Groups punished this instinct hard because unchecked self-promotion destabilizes cooperation. That instinct didn't disappear when tribes became companies. It just got quieter, and it still fires, even in boardrooms, even in performance reviews, even when the self-promotion in question is just an honest account of what actually happened. This is why explaining your own reasoning can feel physically like exposure, even when nothing you're saying is false or boastful. Some old part of the brain is flagging it as social risk, the same category of risk as standing out too much, claiming too much, inviting resentment. Most people resolve this discomfort the easiest way possible, by staying quiet and hoping the work gets noticed on its own. It feels safer. It is not actually safer. It just moves the risk from immediate and social to delayed and invisible. The risk of being misjudged later by someone who was never given accurate material to judge you with. This is the psychology behind it. The fear of seeming self-promoting is louder in the moment than the quieter, slower cost of being misunderstood. Loud and immediate beats quiet and delayed almost every time in how humans make decisions. So people choose the path that avoids the immediate discomfort, even though it reliably produces the worst long-term outcome. Successful people have not necessarily overcome this instinct. Most of them still feel it. What they've done is reframe what the instinct is actually warning them about. They've noticed that the discomfort isn't a signal to stay silent. It's a signal that they're about to do something socially exposed, which is a completely different thing from something wrong. Exposure is not the same as danger, but the old wiring doesn't know the difference, so it treats every moment of self-narration like a small threat, and most people obey that alarm without questioning whether it's still accurate. There's a second piece of psychology at work here, and it's subtler. Most people assume that explaining your own reasoning is inherently defensive, that if you have to explain yourself, something must be wrong. This is a distortion, but it's a common one, because in childhood, explanation was so often demanded only after a mistake. You explained yourself to a parent or teacher when something had gone wrong, rarely when something had gone right. That early pattern quietly wires explanation itself to feel like an admission, regardless of context, well into adulthood. This is worth naming directly, because once you see it, you can separate the two. Explaining your reasoning after being challenged is defensive. Explaining your reasoning before anyone has questioned anything is simply information. Same words in some cases, but a completely different psychological posture, and a completely different effect on the listener. One sounds like someone protecting themselves. The other sounds like someone being transparent. The line between them isn't the content, it's the timing. This is the piece almost nobody sees. Narrative control isn't really about talking more, or talking about yourself more. It's about moving the timing of an explanation from after doubt exists to before doubt has a chance to form. The exact same sentence, said a week earlier, changes category entirely, from defense to disclosure. There's a decision pattern hiding inside all of this, and it explains why some people seem to do this instinctively, while others never learn it at all. People who narrate their own situations well have usually, at some point, made a specific trade. They've decided that the small immediate discomfort of sounding exposed is worth paying, in exchange for not paying the larger, delayed cost of being misjudged. Most people make the opposite trade, not because they've thought it through, but because the immediate discomfort is the only cost that's visible in the moment. The delayed cost, a role you didn't get, a project you didn't get credit for, a mistake that got remembered as bigger than it was, never announces itself as connected to that earlier silence. It just shows up later, disconnected, feeling like bad luck. This is the psychology worth sitting with. It isn't that confident people feel no discomfort narrating their own work. It's that they've learned to read that discomfort correctly, not as danger, but as the ordinary friction of being visible. And they've decided that friction is cheaper than the alternative. There's a related pattern worth pulling apart, because it explains why some attempts at narrative control backfire and end up confirming the exact suspicion the person was trying to avoid. Not all self-narration lands the same way. Say the wrong thing at the wrong moment in the wrong tone, and instead of pre-filling the vacancy accurately, you actually create the very doubt you were trying to prevent. This is why some people conclude that managing perception is manipulative or exhausting and retreat back into silence. They tried it once, it went poorly, and they mistook a technique problem for a proof that the whole approach doesn't work. The difference comes down to a distinction psychologists draw between explanation and justification. And it's a distinction worth being precise about, because the two sound almost identical and produce almost opposite effects. Justification happens after judgment has already occurred, real or anticipated. It carries an invisible tension underneath it, a kind of pleading quality, because it's structured around defending against a verdict. Even phrased calmly, justification signals to the listener that a verdict exists, and the speaker is worried about it. That worry is contagious. The listener, who may not have been forming a judgment at all, now senses there's something to judge, simply because the explanation showed up defensive. Explanation, by contrast, happens in the absence of any anticipated verdict. It's offered the way you'd mention the weather, as information, not as a plea. Here's why I made this call lands completely differently, depending on whether it's delivered with an undertone of hoping to be forgiven or delivered with the flat confidence of someone simply sharing context. Same sentence, different nervous system underneath it. And listeners, whether they could articulate it or not, pick up on which one they're hearing. This is the trap most people fall into when they first try to apply narrative control. They wait until they already feel judged, and then they explain, which means the explanation arrives soaked in the anxiety of justification, even though the words themselves are reasonable. The listener doesn't just hear the content, they hear the emotional posture underneath it, and the emotional posture says, this person thinks they did something wrong. That impression sticks harder than the actual explanation. This is why timing matters more than most people realize, and why just communicate more is incomplete advice. It's not the amount of explaining that determines whether narrative control works. It's whether the explanation arrives before anxiety has entered the room or after. Before anxiety arrives, the identical words read as confidence and transparency. After anxiety arrives, even good words read as defensiveness, because the tone underneath them has already shifted. There's a practical test hiding inside this distinction, and it's simple. If you're explaining something because you're worried about how it will be perceived, you've likely already waited too long, and what comes out will carry that worry whether you intend it to or not. If you're explaining something because it's simply useful context that will save the listener from guessing, and you'd offer it whether or not you were worried, it reads completely differently, because it is completely different. This also clarifies something important about the earlier idea of naming your own trade-offs. It only works as disclosure, not justification, if it's offered before there's any pressure to offer it. A person who says, unprompted and calmly, "I chose speed over polish here because of the deadline, and here's the trade-off I made," is doing something different from a person who says the same thing only after someone raises an eyebrow at the result. The first is narrative control. The second is damage control wearing the same clothes. Both might use identical sentences. Only one of them builds trust. There's a broader principle buried in all of this, one that applies far beyond individual conversations. Control over a narrative degrades the longer you wait to exercise it. Not linearly. It doesn't decline gradually and predictably. It tends to hold steady for a period, and then drop sharply once genuine doubt sets in, at which point almost nothing you say sounds like information anymore. It all sounds like defense, because the listener's frame has already shifted from gathering information to evaluating a claim, and those are two completely different modes of listening. This is the piece almost nobody sees clearly. It's not that quiet people lack the words to explain themselves well. Most people, given the chance, can explain their own reasoning clearly and honestly. What separates the people who benefit from this and the people who don't is almost entirely a question of timing, catching the window while it's still open, before the room has quietly decided there's something to defend against. There's one more layer of psychology worth understanding before this turns practical, because it explains something that trips people up constantly: why the same person can be excellent at narrating some parts of their life and completely silent about others. Most people don't apply narrative control inconsistently by accident. They apply it selectively, based on an unconscious rule most have never examined. They'll defend their competence, but they won't touch anything that feels like it exposes their character. Ask someone to explain a technical decision, and they'll do it fluently, confidently, in detail. Ask them to address a moment where their judgment, integrity, or intentions were misread, and something locks up. This isn't a communication skills gap, it's a different psychological mechanism entirely. Competence threats and character threats are processed differently by the brain, and it's worth understanding why. A competence threat says, "You might have made an error." That's uncomfortable, but it's survivable. Errors are expected, correctable, and don't say much about who you fundamentally are. A character threat says something closer to, "You might not be who you claim to be." That cuts deeper, because it doesn't target a single decision. It targets identity. And identity threats trigger a much stronger defensive response, one that often produces exactly the wrong instinct: withdrawal, at precisely the moment presence is needed most. This explains a pattern that confuses a lot of otherwise sharp people. They'll happily narrate a strategic pivot, a missed deadline, a technical trade-off, anything that lives in the realm of competence. But when something touches on trust, motive, or character, being seen as political, being seen as self-interested, being seen as dishonest, the instinct is to go quiet and simply wait for it to pass. That instinct is almost precisely backwards. Character narratives are the ones most in need of early calm framing, because they are also the ones that compound the fastest if left unclaimed. A skill gap, unaddressed, stays roughly the size it started. A character doubt, unaddressed, tends to grow because every subsequent ambiguous action gets reinterpreted through it. Once someone believes you might be self-interested, your next 3 neutral decisions all start to look like evidence. This is the principle underneath the pattern. The moments people most want to avoid narrating are usually the exact moments narration matters most. The instinct to protect yourself by staying silent about character-level doubt is understandable, but it hands the most consequential story you'll ever be part of to whoever happens to be nearby with the least context and the most convenient interpretation. Here's where the mental model comes into full focus, the one worth naming directly, the narrative vacuum principle. Every ambiguous situation involving a person creates a vacuum where meaning has not yet been assigned. That vacuum does not stay empty. It cannot. Human observers require an explanation for what they witness, and if none is offered, one gets manufactured, usually the simplest, most available, least generous version, because that's what costs the observer the least effort to construct. The principle has one central implication. The only real choice anyone has is not whether the vacuum gets filled, but who fills it. Path A, which most people default to, is to leave the vacuum alone. Stay quiet, let the work or the outcome speak, and correct the record later if it becomes necessary. This path feels safer because it avoids the immediate discomfort of self-narration, but it hands the first mover advantage to chance, or worse, to whoever in the room has the least favorable read on you. Path B, which successful people default to, is to fill the vacuum early, honestly and calmly, before doubt exists, not after, with a frame that is both accurate and favorable. Path B wins for a specific structural reason, not a vague motivational one. First, narratives set the anchor. Once an interpretation exists, it becomes the lens through which every subsequent piece of information gets filtered, and revising an anchor costs far more cognitive effort than forming one, which means most anchors never get seriously revised at all. They just get quietly reinforced by whatever ambiguous evidence shows up next. This is why getting there first isn't a minor tactical advantage. It's very close to the whole game. This reframes the discomfort discussed earlier, the instinctive fear of sounding self-promoting, the flinch around character-level explanation, not as a signal to avoid narrative control, but as the exact terrain where it matters most. The moments that feel most exposing to narrate are reliably the moments where an unclaimed vacuum will cost you the most if you leave it empty. Before moving into application, there's one more piece of psychology worth resolving, because it's the objection that surfaces almost immediately once someone hears the narrative vacuum principle. Doesn't this just describe manipulation with better branding? It's a fair question, and the answer draws a real defensible line, dearie, not a semantic trick. Manipulation at its core involves creating a false impression on purpose, knowing it's false, for personal advantage at someone else's expense. Narrative control, done honestly, involves something structurally different, making sure a true impression exists before a false one has the chance to form by default. The output looks similar. In both cases, someone is shaping how they're perceived. The inputs are opposite. One requires fabrication, the other requires only timing and honesty. Here's a way to test which one you're doing. And it's a useful check for anyone uneasy about this. Manipulation depends on the audience not having full information. It requires concealment somewhere to function. Narrative control, done well, survives full disclosure. If you'd be comfortable with everyone in the room knowing exactly why you said what you said, when you said it, that's disclosure. If the whole thing falls apart the moment your motive becomes visible, that's manipulation. The narrative vacuum principle only works long-term in its honest form because the dishonest form eventually collides with reality, and when it does, the cost is far worse than any vacuum ever left unclaimed. A false frame that gets exposed doesn't just fail. It actively poisons every future frame that person tries to offer, because now their explanations get filed under spin permanently. Trust, once flagged as manufactured, rarely gets fully restored. This is worth sitting with because it explains why some people who try narrative control get burned by it and conclude the whole framework is cynical. Almost always, on inspection, what burned them wasn't narrative control. It was narrative control used dishonestly, or used to obscure something rather than clarify it. The technique didn't fail. The application was actually manipulation, wearing the same language. There's a second objection worth addressing directly, because it comes up almost as often. Isn't this just for people in visible, high-status roles? Doesn't a junior employee or someone without much authority risk looking presumptuous doing this? The evidence points the other way. Narrative vacuums are actually more dangerous for people with less institutional standing, not less relevant to them. Someone with a long track record and established credibility has a reservoir of goodwill that can absorb an unclaimed, ambiguous moment or two. People extend them the benefit of the doubt by default because the anchor is already set favorably from years of accumulated evidence. Someone newer, someone less established, someone without that reservoir, has no such cushion. Every unclaimed vacuum for that person risks becoming the anchor because there's no prior narrative strong enough to override it. This means narrative control isn't a luxury reserved for senior people who've already won the game. It's most urgent, precisely, for people who haven't yet built the reservoir that lets others fill in gaps generously on their behalf. This reframes something important about how to use the mental model. It is not a status display, reserved for people important enough to have opinions about how they're perceived. It is closer to basic self-defense, a way of making sure the earliest, most durable impressions of you are built from accurate material, at exactly the point in a career or relationship when you have the least accumulated credibility to fall back on, if they aren't. Pulling the full psychology together, the mind resolves ambiguity fast, using whatever is easiest to believe, and rarely revises the story once it's set. The discomfort of narrating yourself is real, rooted in old social instincts around self-promotion, but it's a signal about exposure, not danger. The difference between disclosure and defense is almost entirely timing. The same words, said early, build trust, said late, sound like an excuse. And the moments people most avoid narrating, character, motive, trust, are exactly the moments the vacuum is most costly to leave unclaimed. This is the complete psychological picture behind the narrative vacuum principle. What remains is the practical question, not why this happens or why it's hard, but specifically how to do it, in real situations, without it curdling into something that feels forced, performative, or exhausting to maintain. Here is the practical shift, stated plainly. Stop asking, how do I defend myself if this goes wrong? And start asking, what context does this situation need before anyone has to guess? That single reframe changes almost everything about how narrative control actually gets applied day to day. The first practical habit is what might be called pre-framing, offering context before a decision, not after it's questioned. This sounds simple, but most people skip it because the moment for it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel urgent because nothing has gone wrong yet. That's exactly why it works. Before a project launches, before a proposal goes out, before a meeting where an unconventional call will be visible, there's a brief window where a single sentence of context lands as information rather than defense, flagging that I'm prioritizing speed over completeness here, given the timeline, happy to revisit if that's the wrong call. That sentence costs almost nothing to say. Left unsaid, the same decision, discovered later without context, reads as carelessness or an oversight. Notice what that sentence is actually doing. It isn't apologizing in advance. It isn't hedging. It's naming a trade-off the person has already decided to make, on their own terms, before anyone else discovers it and assigns their own explanation. This is the single highest leverage move available, because it happens while the vacuum is still empty, which is the cheapest possible moment to fill it. The second practical habit addresses something covered earlier. Most people are comfortable narrating competence, but freeze around anything that touches character or motive. The application here is a small, specific one when a decision might be misread as self-interested, political, or uncharitable. Name the alternative interpretation yourself briefly, before anyone else raises it. I know this could look like I'm protecting my own team's workload. That's part of it, but the bigger reason is X. This does something a purely defensive explanation never can. It demonstrates awareness of how the decision looks, which is itself persuasive, because people trust someone who can see themselves from the outside far more than someone who seems oblivious to how they're landing. The third habit is about credit, and it requires a small adjustment to something that feels on the surface like modesty. At the close of a project, in a debrief, in a summary email, name specifically what was done and by whom, including your own contribution, in the same plain factual tone used for everyone else's. Not, I did the hard part, but the data model took the most iteration, and that piece was mine. The client relationship was carried by colleague, and that made the difference in the final pitch. This isn't self-promotion, it's preventing compression from erasing something true. Left undone, the retelling of that project months later will compress into whatever fragments happen to survive, and there's no guarantee accuracy is one of them. The fourth habit applies specifically to mistakes, because this is where narrative control matters most and gets used least. When something goes wrong, the instinct is to either over-explain defensively or go silent and hope it's forgotten. Neither works. The alternative is a short, calm, specific account offered once early. What happened, why, what's changing. Not repeated, not revisited unless asked. Said once clearly while the vacuum is still open, because a mistake explained early in one clean pass gets remembered as handled well. A mistake explained late, reluctantly, after being asked about directly, gets remembered as had to be dragged out of them, regardless of how similar the actual content of the explanation is. There's a useful discipline underneath all four of these habits, and it's worth naming as its own principle. Address the vacuum once, plainly, and then let it go. Narrative control that becomes repetitive turns into something else entirely. It starts to look like anxious over-explaining, which reintroduces the exact defensive undertone this whole approach is designed to avoid. The goal isn't constant narration, it's precise, well-timed narration, delivered once, at the moment the vacuum first opens and then trusted to hold. This is the shift in full, from reactive to proactive, from defending outcomes to framing decisions, from hoping the work speaks for itself to making sure the first accurate account of any situation involving you is the one that exists. Not louder, not more frequent, just earlier and only once. Let's take this into three specific high-stakes settings where narrative control determines outcomes far more than most people realize: performance reviews, recovering from a mistake, and being discussed in rooms you're not in. Start with performance reviews, because this is where the gap between doing good work and being credited for good work shows up most starkly. Most people walk into a review and wait to be asked about their year. This hands the framing entirely to the manager, who is working from memory, and memory compresses. It keeps whatever was most recent, most dramatic, or most repeated, and quietly drops everything else, including things that mattered. The alternative isn't arrogance dressed up as a highlight reel. It's arriving with a clear, specific account offered early in the conversation, unprompted. 3 or 4 concrete contributions, framed factually, including the trade-offs made and why. This does something subtle but powerful. It gives the manager's memory an anchor to organize around, rather than forcing them to reconstruct a year from fragments on the spot. Reviews are rarely won or lost on the work itself. They're won or lost on whose account of the work becomes the account. Now, recovering from a mistake, the setting where narrative control is hardest and matters most. The instinct after a visible error is almost always to either disappear for a while, hoping the moment passes, or to over-apologize, which paradoxically keeps the mistake alive longer by repeatedly returning attention to it. Neither serves you. What works is a short, specific acknowledgement, delivered once, early, before the mistake has had time to calcify into a story about your competence rather than a single event. What happened, the direct cause, the concrete change being made. Said once. Not revisited unless someone else raises it. This single early pass does something that months of quiet, careful work afterward often cannot undo on its own. It defines the mistake as an event that was handled, rather than a data point in an unfolding pattern. Silence, in this specific setting, doesn't project calm confidence the way it's often assumed to. It projects nothing, and nothing gets filled in by whoever is nearest to the ambiguity, usually with a less generous read than the truth deserves. Now, the hardest setting of all, being discussed in rooms you're not in. This is where narrative control looks least like a skill and most like a long-term posture, because you cannot be present to shape these conversations directly. What you can do is make sure that well before those rooms convene, the people likely to be in them already have an accurate frame to draw on. Not delivered as a pitch, but built gradually, through the habits already described. Pre-framing decisions as they happen, naming trade-offs honestly, giving credit accurately, addressing mistakes cleanly and once. None of these single moments feels significant on its own. Together, over time, they become the material other people reach for when they're asked to describe you and you're not there to answer for yourself. This is, in the end, the entire aim of the narrative vacuum principle. Not to control every conversation, which is impossible, but to make sure that when conversations happen without you, the story circulating is built from what you actually put there, rather than from whatever was easiest for someone else to assume. Across all three settings, the same underlying move repeats. Get there first, stay brief, stay factual, and let it go. Not defending, not performing, not managing perception moment to moment out of anxiety. Simply making sure that at the specific junctures where lasting impressions form, an accurate account exists before a convenient one does. This is what separates people who seem to move through organizations and relationships with an almost frictionless sense of being understood correctly from people, equally capable, who spend years quietly frustrated that their work never seems to translate into how they're seen. It was rarely a difference in the work. It was a difference in who got to the story first. There's one final piece to this, and it's the part that keeps narrative control from curdling into something exhausting or transactional. Because done wrong, all of this can start to feel like a full-time performance, a constant low-grade anxiety about managing how every moment lands. That's not the goal, and if it starts to feel that way, something has gone wrong in the application, not the principle. The corrective is a simple filter, worth applying before any of the habits already described. Narrate the moments that will actually get compressed into a lasting story and let everything else go completely unmanaged. Not every ambiguous moment matters. Most of them evaporate, forgotten within a day, irrelevant to how anyone remembers you 6 months later. The skill isn't constant vigilance, it's accurate judgment about which handful of moments in a week, a project, a year, are actually load-bearing, the ones likely to become the anchor for a larger story, and reserving deliberate framing for those, while staying loose and unguarded everywhere else. People who do this well are not thinking about narrative constantly. They're thinking about it rarely, at a small number of specific junctures, and otherwise moving through their work with the same ease as anyone else. This distinction matters because it protects against the version of this that does become manipulative or draining. The version where someone starts treating every interaction as an opportunity for image management. That version is exhausting to perform and worse, exhausting to be around, because people can feel when someone is narrating everything rather than living most of it plainly and reserving framing for what actually counts. The narrative vacuum principle is not an argument for constant self-narration. It's an argument for selective, well-timed narration at the handful of moments that will otherwise be filled by someone else's guess. There's also a quieter benefit to this practice that goes beyond how others see you. The discipline of naming your own trade-offs clearly, before anyone asks, tends to clarify your own thinking in the process. It's difficult to say plainly why you made a decision if you haven't actually worked out the reasoning yourself. This means the habit of pre-framing doesn't just shape perception outward, it forces a kind of honesty inward, a check on decisions that might not survive being stated clearly out loud. People who narrate their reasoning well often make better decisions, not because narration improves the decision after the fact, but because knowing they'll need to explain it plainly tends to improve the decision at the point it's actually made. This brings the three insights back together. The pattern is this: every ambiguous moment involving a person creates a vacuum, and vacuums do not stay empty. They get filled always by someone. The psychology is this: minds resolve ambiguity fast using the simplest available story, and rarely revise it once set, which means timing matters more than almost anything else, and the moments people most want to avoid narrating, mistakes, motives, character, are exactly the moments a vacuum is costliest to leave unclaimed. The application is this: pre-frame decisions before they're questioned, name your own trade-offs before others do, protect credit accurately rather than modestly, address mistakes once and cleanly, and reserve all of this deliberate effort for the small number of moments that will actually be remembered, not for every interaction. None of this requires becoming a different kind of person. It requires noticing that you are, whether you intend it or not, being narrated constantly by the people around you, and recognizing that the only real choice available is whether that narration is built from what you actually said or from whatever was easiest for someone else to assume in your silence. Here is the whole picture, brought together. You are never simply observed. You are narrated continuously by everyone who encounters an ambiguous moment involving you, whether that moment is a decision, a mistake, a silence, or an absence from a room where you're being discussed. That narration is not optional, and it does not wait for permission. Every unclaimed vacuum gets filled because the human mind cannot tolerate an unexplained gap for long. The only real question in any given moment is who does the filling. Most people assume good work is self-explanatory, that outcomes speak for themselves, that staying quiet is the safer, more professional choice. It rarely is. Silence doesn't project confidence the way it's often assumed to. It simply leaves the story available to whoever reaches it first, usually with less context, less generosity, and less accuracy than the truth deserved. Successful people did not discover some trick for controlling what others think. They discovered something quieter and more durable. That timing determines whether an explanation reads as honesty or defense, that the moments most uncomfortable to narrate are exactly the moments most costly to leave unclaimed, and that getting there first, briefly and honestly, is worth far more than getting there loudest or getting there last. This is not a call to manage every interaction. It's a call to notice the handful of moments in any week that will actually be remembered, and to make sure that when they are, the account that survives is the one you actually gave, not the one someone else had to invent because you left the space empty. You were always going to be narrated. The work now is simple. Be the one who tells it first.